Again, this session will be run with a didactic presentation, a chance for interactive questions, and then panel comments with the panelists this time being myself. Frank Lexa will be replaced by Alex Norbash. It's not that he flunked his panel responsibilities, it's just that he has other obligations, but he may be back and serve as sort of an alternative or alternate panelist. And then finally, Giles Boland from Mass General will be our third panelist. So we're ready to start, Frank, if you are.
Indeed.
Okay.
And to Larry's point, is there anyone who needs this one-page handout? Here you go.
Henry, why don't you put several down in strategic spots so people come in and get them.
And I'll do that as well. Let's put some here. Take a bunch, and we'll put some here. Now, I think, as Larry was mentioning, the way we envision this is that this session on performance management is sort of the complement to what we were doing earlier in the afternoon about strategy and organization. I see some faces that I know were in the first session. Can I see a show of hands? How many of you were not in the session between 1:30 and 3 p.m.? Okay, all right. Well, what I'm not going to do is give you the Reader's Digest version of what you missed. But I will explain what we're going to focus on in this session. And again, here's the financial disclosure slide. What I'm going to focus on here is not about strategy. I am going to assume, and let me just say very candidly, what I've discovered in the course of my career is that this is a so-called heroic assumption in many organizations. I'm going to assume that your organization has a strategy. It doesn't have to be brilliant, but I'm going to assume is reasonably coherent. I'm also going to make another assumption that in radiology, which is a classic knowledge worker business, as they say, a very, very important part of executing any strategy, any goal in your organization has to do with people. And that's what we're going to focus on in the next hour and a half. A focus on what we do to help or hinder the performance of our people and therefore our own performance in a changing market. And let me, I'll wrap up at the end after the panel discussion with here's some other things you can read. But let me tell you what the research says here, because I find amazingly most people are just not familiar with this research. If you look at organizations that are good at developing their people, how do you know when an organization is good at developing its people? Other organizations hire them, all right? That's the market test. What you'll find in those organizations is they're not good at that because they went to the Mother Teresa School of Management, or that they somehow have discovered some mentoring program that no one else knows about. What you'll find is that those organizations, the leaders, through peer pressure, manage each other in such a way that if you don't develop somebody that you can delegate stuff to, you're not going to make next year's numbers. So it becomes a necessity. So I mean what I say in this first bullet point. The focus of this session is on what we as leaders do to help or hinder the performance of our people and therefore our performance. And that includes financial performance, among other things. We're going to use a brief case study. You are, after all, dealing with someone from Harvard Business School. That's our lingua franca. The case study is this one sheet of paper, 2 pages. If you don't have a copy, please pick up a copy. It's in various places around the room. And then after we spend some time discussing that, I want to link it to a perspective on performance and leadership that I think is useful, and it's relevant to the previous session because this is, again, assuming a strategy. This is how a strategy does or does not get executed in an organization. And here's basically the going in agenda for the next 85 minutes or so. I'm going to set up the topic and the case very briefly. Let's spend some time discussing this vignette, see what we can get out of it. I do have a number of things I want to say about this vignette. And I've got a couple of slides about that, what I think it illustrates. Then I'm going to turn things over to Larry and the panel. And then I would like, if I could, 5 to 10 minutes at the end to sort of go through slides that you can read on your own. You'll get the slides or you can ask for them. You've got the email address. I don't think I need to belabor those, but it's it's a useful stream of research about this topic that you should be familiar with. All right, so that's our agenda. Now, I love the title for this session, Performance Management. What you learn in my line of work is that with a title like that, you can talk about whatever the hell you want. Isn't that terrific? Let me explain what I am going to talk about and what I mean by performance management. It's a process, all right? Performance management in any organization is a process of working with others to develop their competencies to get two things done. The first thing, and this must be the first thing, is that you're developing competencies that get results, right? In your line of work, so-and-so is or isn't good at the pattern recognition, is or isn't, got the right skills and backgrounds for this, does or doesn't deal with colleagues and others in the right way. All of that is marketplace results, but then especially in an industry like yours, and those of you that attended the first session, you just heard this from virtually everybody in the room, you're also developing competencies that get results not just today, but that build capabilities for achieving future goals in the organization. And that's especially true when, as in radiology, you're obviously, you don't need somebody from Harvard to tell you this, you're obviously in a changing industry. So, on this 2x2 matrix, you can see where the sweet spot is. Now, here's what I want you to think about. When you get serious about this topic in an organization, you're doing two things. One is you're identifying people who perform. But the other thing you're doing is also identifying those people whose performance you will invest in. Now, the standard motherhood and apple pie, politically correct thing to say, and certainly management schools are as politically correct as any other part of the university, the standard thing to say about this is, well, we invest in all our people. Nonsense. No manager does that. No organization does that. It may be what you say. It may be what you say when you're interviewing somebody, but that is not organizational reality. Every manager, whether they admit it or not, is in effect differentially allocating his or her time. And they're, in effect, what they're doing daily in any organization is making decisions about what people I'm going to invest time in and what people, that's good, could you just do your work? And, we all find polite ways to say, just don't bother me, do your work. And that's the reality. And of course, the key to this is understanding what are the people, that are worthy of investing time in because of where we're going. Now, what this means is that this process is ensuring that if you do have a strategy or plan, it's first understood. And that was really what we talked about in the first 90 minutes. But you got to think about that as sort of chapter 1 of War and Peace. There's a really long novel that flows from that. The performance management part is, even if we have a strategy that's coherent, how is it embodied and reflected in what the organization does on a daily basis? Its activities, its behaviors. how we allocate resources. And this is one area where we don't have to overcomplexify it. What any manager in any organization is doing when they allocate resources, they're either allocating money, or they're allocating people, or they're allocating time. Their time, the time of their colleagues. That's it. If you think about this as a sort of dashboard, that's all she wrote. But that's what performance management is, that process. Now, what does it mean for people in a leadership position in an organization? What it means is that you've got to ask and then answer these questions. You know the difference between what I do for a living and what you do, all right? I ask questions, you give answers, all right? Those are the rules. You've got to ask and answer these questions. Is this a place, and by a place I mean your organization or your unit, whatever you're responsible for, is this a place where we have clearly articulated the capabilities and attributes that we need to get the results we talk about? Or is it like most organizations? Most organizations hire people, they give them a job description that floats somewhere at 60 or 70,000 feet, and in various ways, various tones of voice, essentially what the organization is saying to that new recruit is, you figure it out. You're smart, you figure it out. And the reality is some do and some don't. So is it a place where we've articulated this? If not, why not? Is there agreement about which capabilities are important for achieving the results we talk about? If you're in a partnership, a small group practice in radiology, if I go in and I talk to you and your partners individually, and I say, what is it you look for? And, what are the key things here? Will I hear the same thing? Or if I talk to 5 people, will I hear 5 different things, or 3 different things, or whatever? And then the last part is, even if there is agreement about this, are these attributes regularly communicated, developed, and modeled, or do we just talk about them? All right? All of that is performance management. Now, let's just spend a little time with what I'm calling this case study, this 2-page case study. I'll give you just about 2 minutes to read it, but I think it's fairly straightforward. We've got 3 characters. We got this guy, John Cutler. John Cutler is a partner in this small group radiology practice, and he's just done, quote, a performance review. Cutler has done the performance review of a guy named Andrew Ross, who's been with the practice 2 years, after completing his residency. And Cutler doesn't feel good about it, so he, among other things, runs into another one of his partners, Amanda Jameson, who gives him advice. Take 2 minutes to read this if you haven't, and then let's ask ourselves these questions. What's going on here? Why would you have done this differently at all? All right? And if anybody needs our little case, they're going cheap. This is the fire sale portion. Price of entry in this room is you got to read this. Now. Hey, don't brag. You got weeks ago. You got it? Oh, you're organized. but the body language tells me most of you have read it. Who wants to get us started? And what I have found is the acoustics in this room are actually pretty good, but if you need a microphone, there's one here, and I've got a handheld. What's going on here? I mean, Cutler obviously sort of feels bad, and then, Jameson says, well, what the hell do you feel bad about? You did what you're supposed to do. All's fair. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you make of this process?
They're working together to rationalize giving a horrible job review. So they're defending to each other why they sucked at doing what they were supposed to be doing, or at least what he was supposed to be doing as part of this. So
people do that? They rationalize?
Sure. He did a horrible job, and her job is to make them feel better about doing a horrible job. And in the end, they did not do the review that they needed to have done.
Now, let me just ask, that's a strong statement, horrible job. What do you consider horrible about what Cutler did or didn't say to Ross?
Well, because they verbalized to each other exactly what their goals are later on. She goes on and says that know your way around the practice, build the practice, participate in committees and activities, so they know exactly what they want him to do. So they've actually done the first part. They have their goals. They just didn't bother to articulate them to the new employee or tell them that they were meeting those goals, exceeding, or falling short of the goals.
And they should have.
They should have.
Others, do you agree? See, as far as you're concerned, this was not a performance review, or it was botched.
Yes.
Others? What do you see going on? And why? I mean, why might this occur? Did we write this case about the one radiologist who's lousy at performance reviews?
Well, it depends on, you mentioned the job description and the expectations, what they were when this person first started the job.
Right.
Was he told that he was supposed to do things? What was he told? Then, by knowing what he was told, then you can measure how he has done against that.
That's in the case exhibits that we didn't give you. But let's make the following assumption, that he was told what I was told when I actually had hair. Once upon a time I looked like Jimi Hendrix, and I worked in a consulting firm, and they said, we're glad you're here, and if you do good work, you'll get promoted, and someday you too will be a partner. That was more or less the job description. Wrong?
It's still pretty vague.
Well, what would not be vague?
We have certain committees, and everyone in the company is supposed to choose something, join a committee, make some kind of marketing effort, join the QA committee, join the technology committee, take part in group activities.
And if you don't?
Well, then that's when you can talk about that at the evaluation.
Okay.
That has to be outlined. Right now, this person thinks he or she, this person thinks he's going to be a partner. He's getting raises and he's
Others? What do you see? And by the way, what I get, what the assumption I think we should make is that when it comes to the actual point of care work, this young man is pretty good. We don't have a problem with that, but he doesn't seem to raise his hand for X. He doesn't seem to do anything that's beyond whatever that job description is. For the two of you, that's a big deal, is what I'm hearing. It's not good enough simply to do good work.
He could be replaced by a contractor.
Excuse me?
He could be replaced by a contractor.
Okay, you're right. If it's just about work, maybe I could subcontract, but it's not. It's about ultimately a partnership decision. And for you, that goes beyond the actual work.
We're putting all the focus on the junior, radiologist, but what about the practice leader? He's behaving in a way that he's sort of a reluctant leader. He's not performing. He's not mentoring this junior radiologist to do what's expected.
And what would that sound like or look like? What would happen in a performance review that you would consider mentoring? Notice what the young radiologist says, at least according to Cutler, when he asked about next steps and his development, And when he could expect a decision on his partnership status, I told him to be patient, meaning, hey, there's going to be, we need more information, right? Fair, not
That
fair?
was the thing for the leaders to step in and say, these are the things that we need you to be doing in addition to, producing our reviews, the committee work, the marketing, et cetera. But he didn't do that.
Well, yeah.
I think you can make the argument that the practice leader is actually misleading.
I'm sorry, a little louder is actually what?
I said, I think you make the point that the practice leader is actually a little misleading as well, because he said, I told them you're going to find a job with patients, you're going to join them,
Yeah.
you'd like to join us, that kind of thing. There's no specifics here. It's just kind of a broad brush,
Yeah.
happy to be here.
It reminds me, in the consulting firm I joined, I always remember the first performance review I got, and I confess, I made a vow never to inflict it on someone else, but it was very much like this. All these cases have a autobiographical component, but it was, Frank, you do good work, but you're, quote, not strategic. Now, I'm 25 years old, someone twice my age is telling me that. The truth is, I didn't have a clue what the hell that meant. I had no idea what that meant, but at 25, I said, yeah. And for you, that's what's gone on here. Am I right about that? No.
Yeah, I think the fact that this is an annual review indicates that there probably wasn't the mentoring the new person needs a lot more often, more frequent than annual. It's never been shown how to translate the material core values and strategies into what is becoming what is expected behavior on a daily basis. That's something that needs to occur earlier, more frequently than on an annual basis.
Okay, so that there should be a process here so that the review, what are most reviews like in organizations? It's sort of gotcha, right? Yeah, but what about this? What would you have said to this guy, Stephen? What would you have said, given the circumstantial evidence we have? It's a short case. He does, he apparently does the clinical job adequately. He's fine. We need his particular set of skills, the case suggests, but he's not a good citizen. That's also
It's
clear.
a responsibility that we need to work together to better articulate what it is that we expect from you. It's clear that you're not meeting what we've done our job to convey them to you, so we'd like to assign you a mentor or work with you, or I'll be your mentor and establish what those are and work toward them.
Okay, but can we get more specific than that even at this point?
I don't think it's fair to say he's not a good citizen because he's performing up to the standards that he was told or that he inferred from other actions in the corporation. And, the comment she has, your actions spoke louder than your words. Well, no, they didn't. And I think you bring him in, you say, well, you performed admirably according to the goals that we thought we gave you and that you had, but now we need to give you some new goals, some things to move beyond your early period of partnership. You've done the basic work, but here's some things we'd like to see you working on for the next year or two.
Now you say his actions didn't speak louder than his words. What are you getting at there?
The only action, I'm confused by that line because his only action was he didn't offer a partnership. And other than
He gave him the raise that was in the contract and said, just be patient. We're checking this out.
his actions spoke against his words. His actions said, we think you're great, we're giving you a raise, you're stellar. And instead, the untold words are that, you're not performing up to what these unwritten goals and aspirations are, and we think you're on track to be terminated.
Yeah. Just two things, and again, it sounds so obvious when I say it, but I found I've got to say this. One is, whatever else your people are good at, I guarantee they're not good mind readers, right? So whenever you hear that phrase, actions speak louder than words, you got to ask yourself, what are we really talking about? Because they cannot read your mind. On the other hand, I come in, I'm told X, Y, Z, and I get a raise. How would you expect any human being to respond to that? Just, do it again.
Right. I'm doing a good job.
What should they be doing? Because again, what the case tells us is that neither of these partners particularly relishes the act of doing a performance review. How many of you like doing performance? How many of you do performance reviews? Let me see. I think some tell me this is not a representative ACR audience with that many hands. How many of you like it? I wish I could raise my hand. The big learning for me when I left academia and ran a business is you had to sit down and do these reviews. And it wasn't fun, it wasn't easy. It took years before I felt we got even adequate at it. How should this conversation have worked? Should we have said, hey, you either get out of the closet or you're not going to make partner? Is that what you would have said to him?
Well, I think right now, the only thing this associate knows that in order for him to be a partner is just to be patient. That's the only guidance that he can give him, is to be patient. So his assumption is if I'm patient and I keep doing what I'm doing, I am going to be a partner.
Yep. Yep. In that sense, there was a message communicated. There's GS10, GS11, GS12. Your time will come. Yeah.
At this point, if they articulate what they want to be for partners, it's still kind of a, it was like a false representation of moving the goalpost now. We've been fine for however many time to keep moving them. So you have to do this at the outset. So they're either stuck with this guy, say they screw this up, they got to go to a partner, or they're going to turn into an associate. Now, they already ran the Vancouver last year, and now they're going to get with another associate. It's going to be a huge warning flag. Anybody wanting to join this group, saying these guys are just preserving their salary and they're basically eating their young.
Yep.
They're carrying through an associate period, kind of stringing along. You can see that they basically end up being dishonest.
2 points. I hope everybody in the room could hear what he was saying, but does this fellow Ross, will he feel the goalposts have been changed at this point? I think there's a high probability he will. The second is, notice what he's saying about the what I'll call the second and third order effects. I don't know how this works in your profession, but at Harvard Business School, one of the things that has always amazed me in the time I've spent there, the MBAs, when it comes to recruiting, I mean, you just can't pull any wool over their eyes. They know the firms that are recruiting. They know the firms where it's possible to build a career, and where if I'm there 2-3 years, if they pay off my debt, that's all I want. I don't know how that works in med school, but it works. That's going to be my presumption, that what you do or don't do in effect generates your employee brand. So is it too late? Do we got to promote the sluggo?
They already got rid of Mancuso, so now they're starting to set up the trend. This guy, they've already had him strung along for 2 years, or however long it's been. So they have to make a choice. We have to start over now. But I think they've invested too much in this guy. I mean, they have to really consider their options here. But what they
remember the rules. I ask questions, you give answers. What would you do? They've got to hire him. The irony, of course, is why did they put in this process so that we wouldn't, obviously there's some history. It's like, dare I say so, certain tenure decisions, you say, like, never again if we can help it. But you're saying, no, they blew it, at least with this individual.
I'd say it was a more pervasive problem with this group because they're not practicing what they preach. They wanted their expectations, they say, and be part of it, et cetera. But when no one in the group performs in a way that they supposedly expect, i.e. don't do these things on behalf of the company, don't do the extra special things, his compensation stays the same, nothing changes, there's no repercussions at all. So
yeah.
You got a bigger problem.
Yeah. Let me ask you then, because, let's go talk about a different character. How does this begin? I feel so crummy, says Cutler, and then his colleague, how did you phrase it? They've rationalized, right, and what are colleagues for, except always to say, well, of course you're right, you're never wrong. What would you have said to this guy if you had a colleague who came out and basically told you this story? Would you have said, hey, now you got no choice, you got to promote him, or would you have said schmuck? I mean, what would you have said?
Personally, I would have been realistic in what we are. And we're a group that doesn't really do this in any of it. And I would say, in order to be fair to him, he's just like us.
You ran a for-profit business, didn't you? Yeah. And yet you're basically agreeing with him that we somehow have to now go down this road. Yes?
The question needs to be, should Cutler and Davis need to do performance evaluation systems for their group? It's easy here in this room, we all have this discussion. Physicians are not probably the ones that need to be making these decisions for themselves. You need an HR person to actually sit there and think about it. Like, I teach residents. In my first year residents, I give them a lot of criticism, but it's constructive criticism, not the same stuff. My God, good work, keep going.
Yep.
Like, you have to provide them an opportunity to grow. You have to show them, in this situation, you probably would have hired him and for 1 year, see if he's able to take the initiative on his own. Then do a real performance evaluation system, and now give him another year to see, does he take the constructive criticism, the deficiencies, and rectify them? Then this is something that can talk.
Yep.
Can learn to do something.
I agree with that. This is a teachable skill. Now, to his point, you'd have made that 3-year cycle clear.
You have an opportunity to do that, but at some point, even in year 6 months, you have to identify his deficiencies and allow him to remediate them. And if he's still stubborn and doesn't do what you want him to do by being involved, then that's when you can cut your ties with. But essentially, you're right, you're playing a mind reading game. It's like when I said with my resident, I'm like, well, tell me what I think. I ask them a question, and it's very, like, what am I thinking? And I realize I do that with them sometimes.
Yep.
But in this situation of prior practice, this is a guy's livelihood, who's a young associate who doesn't want to step on toes.
Yep.
Who's probably in a probation.
Not just his livelihood, let's be clear about this, it's his identity, right? You've all been there. Because, it's not just about pay and promoting, this is who I am. But you made an interesting point, Tejas, and, again, I just wanted to use this to tee up the more important discussion. Neither of these partners, Cutler or Jameson, likes this. I think we're agreed they're not very good at it. At best, they're drive-by. You're saying we should get a professional, HR professional. How many of you agree with that? That this should be something that someone who does this for a living, so to speak, does the reviews, not the folks that have their skin in the game, the practice partners. That would be one way to, one hopes, deal with this.
I don't know if it would be exclusively an HR person, but I would say that's somewhat of the role that I've taken on in my group, and I'm an administrator and I'm a physician.
Yep.
And I call the shots as straight as I can, try not to miss words.
After you get input from others about so-and-so.
The executive committee discussing a problem child, blah, blah, blah. Me and the president go and deal with it.
Yeah. You're known as the enforcer, is that it?
I am. But somebody has to be. I go back to the previous section that what they're doing here is enabling the group to stay in the middle of all the strategies and diluting their focus. And I think the game's changed now where we can't just do this anymore. And in the service industry, human resources is the single most important business function. So if you don't have the right people, you're never going to succeed in your designated quadrant, so to speak. So you need to know who you are and what you're delivering. Does this guy fit in or not? Because if you bring him in as a partner, you own him. It's not like you can't fire a partner because you've done that too. But, basically you own him for 25 or 30 years. And where is that picture?
Yep.
I mean, you really have to be frank, I think.
Yeah. And to your point, you can almost see, why did this practice start this process, right? They told us, but also, hey, it's a different world out there. We do have to actively market. Now, what does marketing mean here? It can mean all these visibility issues you've been talking about in lots of other sessions. This young man doesn't seem right for that. Somebody's got to say that. Yeah. Any other comments about this? Because then I want to give you a little bit of advice about the how part, but I don't see anybody here agreeing with Amanda Jameson that, hey, he's an adult, we were an adult, and by the way, we don't have to promote him, we can do another Mancuso and then deal with the recruiting implications as they arise.
But there's one other comment, and even what both of them said quite explicitly, we don't mentor, we don't help.
Yeah. I'm damn proud of it.
No, I mean, it's like, so you know, it's like they're basically saying to physicians, we don't want to help anyone, and we want them to see this. So whether that's a valid position or not, that's your position.
Now, but let me yeah, but let me use different language, because if we phrase it as sink or swim, you know, it sounds one way. But let's assume that what they're saying is, look, the reality is that in the time frame we have to make these long-term judgments, we're only going to learn so much, and that human being is going to change over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, right? I mean, I found that with my partners. And at the end of the day, we can only do just so much. They have to self-select. So we're not saying sink or swim. We're saying show us. And if you do, good. And if you don't, well. Do good work. Be a good citizen. Help out with all the possibilities. The standard stuff.
But according to what they're saying, he's not doing that.
Well, he hasn't demonstrated it yet. Yeah.
I also think, though, that, and I'm making a guess, but these two partners figured it out themselves.
Yep.
And so there is something about kind of the fraternity effect. This is the way I got there. No one mentored me. No one coached me. I figured it out, and I was successful without the help or without the mentoring and coaching.
Yeah. How common do you think that mindset is?
I think
Yeah.
it's fairly common.
Yeah, I think it's true in most hierarchies. Yeah.
And even like if a group makes a promotion, I've heard, well, when I got promoted, no one did anything special for me. I found out in an email.
Yep.
No one made an announcement for the rest of the group. So I've heard that across various practices.
You know, just to your point, just a factoid, then I'm going to, I want to say a few things about this. But you remind me with your comment, the business I ran, at some point in the 12 years I ran that business, I'm going to date myself. Do you remember when public accounting firms were known as the Big Eight? Now they're what we call the Final Four, right? But we worked with all four of these firms. And they all said they're unique. They all do the same darn thing. I mean, you know, just every 7 years, flip a coin, pick another one, all right? But it was very interesting. We worked with two of these firms. They asked us to work with them on talent management. So what do? You go, you interview the partners. And it was, in both firms, you heard exactly the same thing. Every partner said, hey, when I made my way up, there were no rules, no processes. It was terrible, and we need to change that. And then you would ask the next question, which was, but how did you get through without no rules and processes? And what you'd always hear is, oh, I was lucky because Charlie or Charlotte took an interest and was in effect my rabbi or mentor. And you'd hear this from literally hundreds of people. So the phenomenon you're talking about is very, very real. Now, just a couple of comments about the case, because I just want to generalize a bit for this. In a people business, and this is what you're in, there are some key fundamental performance skills, and that's one of the reasons for using this little case. One of them is the ability to have a meaningful performance conversation, which is what any review is. The second is the ability to deliver feedback so that it's heard. I would argue that what this guy's colleague, Amanda, says is not out to lunch. When she says, well, look, you preserved his self-esteem, et cetera, et cetera. That's important. If you're going to work with people, it is important that they leave motivated. On the other hand, I think what we all agree with is this guy didn't get any real feedback. The third is this. And this is the way I think about, the issue that this gentleman was raising. At the end of the day, in a professional services organization, which is what you have, you can talk any way you want when you're off-site at a conference. But if you don't have somebody who can replace X, you're just going to suffer with X. Doesn't matter what you say when it's off-site. So the third part here is the ability to build the bench. And ironically, that's why they put this process in the first place. But it's sort of like Hamlet. It's more honored in the breach than the observance. Now, What makes this hard? You know, when I asked how many of you enjoyed it, most hands went down. The first is avoidance. You would rather not have it. Now, it may not be as extreme as in this vignette, where they designate real work as what they do in their clinical work and everything else is not. But, you know, it's not like a lot of people enjoy having these conversations. The second is the natural concern about delivering bad news. I mean, I remember a performance review I had to do that I thought was pretty clean cut. And I'll be honest, for a few minutes, I thought this guy was going to go postal. I was physically afraid. Now, that was not the norm, but there was an emotional issue behind this. The third is feeling that you're afraid of backlash or resistance, simple conflict avoidance. We all want to be liked, especially in, you know, small, medium-sized group practices. You know, it's not like this is Apple Computer or something. You got to work with your colleagues on a daily basis. And then, to your point, the all-purpose rationalization. Yes, this is important, but I'm too busy for this right now. The most important thing to understand, I think, is that whatever makes the conversation hard is probably why you need to have it in the first place, right? I mean, that's usually the way it works. Now, when it comes to delivering feedback, these are examples, and I want to emphasize this, these are examples about how not to deliver feedback. Let me explain where this comes from. About 6 years ago, one of the government agencies located not far from this hotel was the target of a discrimination suit. Now, the first thing the lawyers always do whenever that happens, this is true throughout the nation, is you subpoena the performance reviews. Because typically what you're going to find is Lake Wobegon, as we do in this vignette. Everybody's above average, so you can see how it works. Well, these were the reviews, then you fired so-and-so or didn't give him or her a promotion. It must be for these other reasons. That's, you know, the standard way. In this government agency, however, everybody had tenure. You couldn't fire anybody. So what was clearly going on is that the managers were just venting their frustration in writing up the reviews. My favorite here happens to be the last one. The wheel is turning, but the hamster is dead. This, again, I want to emphasize this, how not to deliver feedback. There are two really important things in giving effective performance feedback, and I urge you to think about them. The first is to be, as a number of you said, descriptive and specific, not broad and general. Very, very important. And, you know, overly general feedback is usually little more than some perception, and it's likely to increase defensiveness. You know, at some point, what do you want to say to this guy, Ross? Hey, get a personality. I mean, get out there. You've got, you know, we expect you to contribute with all these other things. Now, how you say that is awfully important. Descriptive feedback describes observed performance and behavior and encourages discussion. Now, what I notice with executives is that when I say this, by and large, what happens is what's happening in this room. People nod their heads and say, that's right. It can't be general, it has to be specific. Please understand the leadership implication for doing this, because somebody pointed this out earlier. If you're going to be specific in giving feedback, you can't simply do what most managers do, which is they start to pay attention 1 week to 10 days before the scheduled review. You've got to be paying attention throughout the year. And unless your memory far exceeds most people, you got to take notes, you got to have a process for doing this if you're going to avoid the overly general platitudes that most performance reviews are. The second issue here is to focus on the behavior, not the person. Now, this one is very important, and different people do this differently. How many of you remember Jack Welch, the CEO of General Electric, who, by the way, is not a nice guy? all right? I mean, he's got this reputation, and it's true. They were, you know, I did a ton of work with them under the Welch regime, and while I respect him, you sort of said, whoa. I mean, this guy could unload. How many of you, he's still alive and fighting the government tooth and nail, Mo Greenberg of AIG? Again, a notoriously, how shall I say, overt feedback manager. The interesting thing about both of those CEOs is when you talk to people that reported to them, and you say, well, how do you feel about this? I was just at that meeting. You know, he's sort of like in front of everybody. You'd always hear the same thing. Well, you know, Jack, Mo, it's not about me, it's about the business. That they established a context. They established a mode where it's about what we're doing, in your case, perhaps, as a partnership, not about you and your personality. Now, to the outsider dipping in, that was not apparent to me. It sure looked to me like, you know, somebody was sort of got blown up in front of their colleagues, but it's not the way it was felt, and that's the more important thing. So focus on the behavior, not the person. Feedback relative to the person as a whole does not add value and may deter, not motivate improvement. And by the way, this is what most performance feedback is. If you think about what people are saying with those platitudes, they're basically saying, get born again, right? I mean, what are you supposed to do with that? I mean, you know, what do I have to do? Tell my mother to try again? I mean, but that is what the message often is. So focusing on the behavior, not the person, is important. This is a list you can read for yourself, but these are the 5 things that I think are awfully important around this topic. The first one is to convey your positive intent. Here I want to get back to your recommendation. If we do not have a positive intent about an employee, that's a different conversation. It's a conversation about either moving him or her to a new job or a new organization. But if this is somebody you're going to be working with and continue to work with, you convey your positive intent, describe what you've observed. Why is this important? State the impact of the behavior or action. Why should I, you know, think about it. If the feedback this guy gets is you should serve on committees if you want to be a partner, do you think he's going to serve on committees? Is that what we want? We want people ticking off activity boxes? Why is this important? What's the end game? Ask the other person to respond, and then focus the discussion on options and solutions, because ultimately what you want to be doing here is moving yourself from doing to enabling others. Notice the 2 partners in this vignette. If Ross is not contributing on these other activities, the math is pretty clear. Who is doing that work? They are. You are. Again, we do this to increase our own wingspan. I want to give each of you a suggested exercise to do when you leave this, and then explain why, and then I'll turn things over to our panel for a bit. I want you to imagine that your professional life falls into 3 categories. One is doing. You do the activity. You read I'm going to say the X-ray. I'm dating myself, but you know what I'm talking about. You do X, you do Y. The other is managing, all that administrative stuff that you have the happy job of doing. And the other is, you know, what in the last decade we call leading, enabling, setting direction, etc. All else being equal, what would be the ideal division of your time among doing, managing, leading? Now, you might first think about what you mean by ideal. Ideal for what purpose or outcome, right? Maximize income. Or, well, no, I'm reasonably happy, but I wish I had more time for X, Y, or Z, or whatever, all right? And again, this is not a precise science, make a reasoned guess, but do the pie chart. The next step in the exercise is the reality check. Go back and look at your calendar for whatever is the relevant time frame. 6 months, a year, year and a half, whatever it is. How do you actually divide your time among doing, managing, leading? When people do this, what is the result most of the time? And by most of the time, I mean in excess of 80% of the time. I want to do more of what and less of what. What do you think? 80% of the time.
More leading, less doing.
That's exactly right. More leading, less doing. Now, when that happens 80% of the time, there's got to be something reasonably systemic going on. It can't be that, it's always the same issue. Why do we usually tend to emphasize doing? Because of how we see our role as managers, right? This is what managers do. What we believe made us successful, right? You do good work, that's part of it. Becoming tools of the tools, big issue in the 21st century. Failure to appreciate the value added of our leadership role. This may take some explaining, and I think the best way I can explain this is by a true anecdote, which this vignette reminds me of. Back when I had hair, and before I got my doctorate and became a professor, I worked for a consulting firm, all right? It's one of the big firms you'd all recognize. There was a partner there that I did a lot of work with. This guy was one of the more talented and sloppy human beings I've ever met in my life. His name was Ralph. He weighed more than 300 pounds. He'd walk into big important meetings, the tie had ketchup all over it, the fly is open, that sort of thing. But a great, great consultant. He could cut to the chase about an issue, and he could connect with people, all right? Now, we have an opportunity. How many of you remember an oil company called Texaco? Okay, I don't feel so old. We're pitching for a big, big project at Texaco. So's McKinsey, so's BCG, so are we. And we got 60 minutes with the COO. And my job, I was the associate, my job was the typical job of the associate in the 80s, and I'm not joking. One is to do all the analysis, relieve the partner of any analytical job whatsoever. And the second, and this is in the days before PowerPoint, to prepare the transparencies, right? And by the way, there was a third job, and we were literally trained to do this. Always bring a spare light bulb for the transparency projector. I'm not joking, that was part of the training. We get down to Texaco, which at the time was headquartered in White Plains, New York, and we got 60 minutes with the chief operating officer. So we walk in, and here's Texaco COO, here's Ralph. I'm in the typical associate supplicant position, about 5 feet southwest of Ralph, and they start to talk. And as far as I can tell, they're talking about everything except the project we've been asked to talk about. The COO says, yeah, that's true, but you got to watch out for Charlie. Charlie may not know what he's talking about, but the board loves him. And, Ralph asks a question, and they laugh, and they joke, and then they talk about something else in the organization. They didn't use a single one of my transparencies. But at the end of that 60 minutes, we had the job. And it was a big job. This was like, $5,1984, big job. So we walk out of his office, and we're waiting for the elevator. Ralph's feeling pretty good, right? And he sort of looks down at me, and he says, well, kid, what'd you think? I'm 25 years old. I'm naive. So I told him exactly what I thought. I said, wow, they pay you for that? What did I not understand about that meeting? What about that meeting at 25 just went like this? I didn't have a clue. What was that meeting about? And I didn't understand it. But relationships for what purpose, David? What?
So they can work.
Right? Why weren't they looking at the transparencies that I spent a whole damn weekend developing?
I think the CEO wants to see what it can work for the guy.
Yep. And notice, he's looking at us, we were Bain, McKinsey, Bain. How much difference is there really between us? Right? They can assume a certain level of quality. Can you work with me and my people? When I'm not there, can I trust you to do the right thing? That sort of. I didn't get any of that. That's what I mean by failure to appreciate the value added of our leadership role. And it's very, very common in what I call high IQ organizations. And that's what you have. And the good news is you got a high IQ. The bad news is dummies don't know how to do this. It's only people with high IQs that can rationalize. And they're so good at it because they're so articulate. Enjoyment of tasks with immediate feedback, and then this last point, risk and uncertainty about the capabilities of our colleagues beyond the usual suspects. Now, let me explain what I mean by this, then I'm going to turn things over to the panel. Almost every manager, and this is especially true in partnership type organizations as in this vignette, has a circle of go-to people. Do you understand what I mean by go-to people? This is the person you turn to when something important is on the table, when you want to make sure it's done with the right level of quality control, common sense, etc. All right? One way to think about developing an organization is increasing that circle of go-to people. And you do that one person at a time, which is why performance reviews are important. What characterizes go-to people? First, they have a track record of success. It's not just that they're good looking, right? But they've demonstrated their abilities in certain areas. More quickly than others, they figure it out. Most importantly, they figure out you. They know you. Does so-and-so want the details or just the executive summary? You know, my business, that I ran, this may sound trivial, but people knew you didn't ask Frank for a decision before the second cup of coffee in the morning. Because unfortunately, you might get a decision that's probably going to be wacky. But they just understand that. They understand the organization, how it really works, how you really get stuff done there. They do get it done on time, on budget. They do good work. They're relatively self-managing and low maintenance, so what are they doing for you? They're freeing up your time and energy to get other stuff done. And especially in an extraordinarily high transaction area like radiology, I assume you all intuitively understand the value of that. What's their experience? The experience of go-to people. It's what you might call a spiral of success. They're the people that get delegated interesting, important work, and I'll show you the results, when I just wrap up. This is how people develop. Adults, we know this. The research about this is definitive. Adults learn not in seminars like this, by and large. Adults learn on the job. It is by far the most important way that adults learn, so it's what they actually do. Because they're getting interesting, important work, they receive more managerial time and attention. I want to get back to this gentleman's comment because I think it's very, very important. We needed to do this from the beginning. We need to do it more than once a year. That's exactly right. How does this work in an organization, right? You delegate to me important work. You're no dummy. What you say is, look, and by the way, around this project, why don't you come into my office every Friday at 2 and we'll talk about it for an hour. That's where you're giving real feedback. What are you saying during that hour, right? Well, did you talk with David? He had this issue a year ago and it either went well or blew up. Why don't you talk to him about his experience? Or, have you thought about X, Y, and Z? That's the kind of support they're getting. That attention and support plus their own relationships helps to build their confidence and commitment. They experience more success and recognition. And when go-to people fail, they get a chance to play again. That is the value of reputation in an organization. You get a chance to play again. Now, what's the experience of no go-to people? The danger with the Rosses of the world. They're not delegated important work. They tend to get the same, Henry Ford's definition of history, the same damn thing again and again and again, diminishing their interest, confidence, and competence. They receive little time and attention from leadership because they're the ones doing the routine work. I mean, didn't you learn this in med school? I got to talk to you about this? I thought we hired you because you knew this. They increasingly feel out of the loop, diminishing their commitment. They get less recognition for success. Yeah, it's routine work. Hey, we're outsourcing this to India half the time. And their failures are correspondingly magnified. Geez, couldn't even do the routine work. And what tends to happen over time is that they seek the safety of what some people call invisibility, eventually checking out. Either physically they go somewhere else, or mentally, right? These are the people at meetings that just sit there and go, that sort of thing. Now, the point is that building a bench and growing capability in a people business means more go-tos, and you can't do this abstractly. That's why performance reviews are so vital. You've got to do it with individual human beings. You've got to do it, as they used to say years and years ago at HP, one bench at a time. And to do that, you also have to engage, if I can say so, since we're in DC, in a form of McCarthyism. You got to name names. I mean, there's no such thing as building a culture in the abstract. You only build that culture in any organization with individuals. And you might want to think about your people this way. Who are the people that are already there? Your job there is to constantly motivate them. Who are the people that won't get there? Then we make the hard decisions. But it's these folks, which apparently Ross had the capability of being, these are the ones where these reviews are so important. But to do that, every organization, as you pointed out, needs a shared language of performance. And when I wrap up, I'm going to just make some suggestions about where you could go for that shared language if you don't have it in place in your organization. But what I want to do at this point, I think, is make sure that we have some time for the panel discussion around this topic. And then, Larry, I'm going to rely on you as a master of ceremonies. I need about 5 to 7 minutes at the end to sort of just explain what's on these other slides that you can take with you.
Okay, well, I'll invite the panel to put on a mic and then turn it on so you can show your leadership and go-to capabilities. And does anybody, we'll get a couple of comments from the panel and then open it to questions. Giles, do you want to start?
Is it working? Yeah.
Yep.
What was the question? I was listening.
Next panelist then.
So I do a fair amount of going around, as Larry does, around the country, and as part of either working with the college on Imaging 3.0 or doing consulting. And we do this really badly on the whole. I would say most of the practices that I go to, and I've probably been to about 150 or so, it's a fair amount. They're in most of these organizations, if you ask people the right questions, and you have to frame it in the right way, you can't sort of go, I've got you here, you're looking for it, but you've got to build a certain amount of trust with the leaders there before you can start asking these more difficult questions, that there is a percentage, usually fairly small, of persistent problem people. And certainly those are the ones in Frank's slider, which are down the bottom, which I can't remember the 3 categories: someone who is already excelling, someone who's going to excel, and someone who's never going to excel. And routinely, we fail to, we tolerate them. And in my opinion, it becomes more than just the individual. And then what happens is that the lack of accountability then brings others down and demotivates the people who actually want to do well and want to exceed. And in fact, you get to the point where it's a perverse situation where those who are excelling actually start to decelerate because they're putting in the extra work to cover for the folks that are really not pulling their weight. So the whole situation becomes, to some form or another, depending on the degree and the number of people in that organization, relatively dysfunctional. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, A, is it just about this individual? And B, if we recognize that in fact the whole performance of the group or the organization is potentially suffering from this, what am I, as the person who's responsible, or whoever we delegate, going to do about it? Maybe I'll just leave it as that as a comment.
Alex?
I have a few.
Yeah, so it's working.
I have a few disconnected thoughts. So let me start by saying that it struck me that the first several responses to some of Frank's questions were pretty emotional. And the reason I point that out is I think we all have some heated memories about this space in terms of how this has affected our own lives.
Yeah, usually other.
Thank you. Sorry. I was mentioning that I noticed as some of the early responses came into Frank's questions that they were emotional. They were emotional responses. So this is something that I think affects all of us and affects us profoundly, from instances when we feel as though others have been unfairly not castigated when they should have been, or when feedback has come back to us and it has not been sufficiently direct and sufficiently transparent. So I think it's interesting to see that this is a great topic that you picked. And I think this is a great stimulation because it's near and dear to all of our hearts. So I think there's several issues that were apparent to me. First of all, the nature of an organization is determined by how rules-based it is and how transparent it is. And there are a couple of things about this organization that seem kind of, from a derivative approach, apparent. One, there's not a strong culture of mentoring, right? It doesn't seem as though the senior partners feel compelled to either coach, advise, or mentor the junior individuals. And so that's a character trait of this organization where these two senior partners are concerned. So that tells you the nature of the organization. And that's something we all have to consider. What kind of an organization am I in? Does it reflect my values? Is it a good fit for me, or is it not? So one thing that's clear is that it's also not transparent. And in terms of transparency, the communication isn't explicit, the goals aren't clearly stated, and it's kind of that means that the organization isn't going to move beyond a certain point. So another natural question that pops up is, what role do we play in defining an organization as individuals? So you may seek to drive your organization to transparency, but if you don't have a mandate to do that, and if you're not sufficiently empowered, it's not going to happen from the bottom. So this is interesting in terms of looking at the type of organization, does not have mentoring, does not have good communication, it's not particularly transparent, so it's a flawed organization. So in a flawed organization, something like performance reviews, they're checking off a box by saying we're doing it, but they're not actually utilizing it the correct way. And there's a statement in here about how since we've employed performance reviews, so performance reviews in this organization are a new thing, and you can't fix an organization and make it transparent by just putting in place performance reviews. You have to have a larger structure and a system that kind of explains, obviously, mission, vision, values, where the organization is going. And so this seems as though it's not a mature organization, it's not a high-functioning organization. And one of the problems with radiology for us is we have had a surfeit for so long that we haven't necessarily all had to be high-performing organizations. And I think that's a challenge, and that's one of the reasons that Giles is going around, is he's seeing this variation in the quality of organizations that we have, and it includes things like mentoring, transparency, having a rules basis, and having a system that is high-performing. So this, to me, it's not a surprising example. It's a real example, and it really struck home in terms of the validity of this particular example that you chose.
Okay, a couple of things, and then we'll open it to questions. First of all, I know it's late in the afternoon, but Giles said that he and I individually, once together, but individually go around the country working with practices, and then next sentence says, we don't do it very well. I think he was talking about radiologists in general, not our ability to work with practices. Okay.
Touche.
Okay. First of all, this is an atypical group. I mean, A, you're here. B, you do reviews. Because I can tell you that most practices throughout the country do not do reviews. So critically important, do 360 type reviews on your members at least once a year and provide appropriate feedback from those reviews. I know different business school, Frank, Jim Collins used to say, have autopsies without blame. So there has to be a way that you can remediate someone and discuss his or her limitations or issues in a way that's constructive. The second thing is most practices don't monitor. And it's really a two-edged problem for young people because most academic programs don't prepare them for the real world. So they come out not knowing what's expected, and then the radiology practice itself doesn't tell them what is expected of them. It's like, you're here, okay, you're batting sixth and playing right field. Or, here's your workstation, we'll see you at 5 o'clock this afternoon. So we have to develop appropriate mentoring. And one very interesting thing we learned from GE is that when they have new people, they put a senior executive as a mentor as a two-way mentor. The young person teaches the older leader how to be productive in the digital world. The older person teaches the younger person how to navigate the treacherous political waters. That is a terrific thing because with the lack of mentorship, what you have is a partner to be who's scared silent. And then 2 years later, after they're made partner, they unzip the suit and out steps the real individual, and you've not had an opportunity to deal with the good or the not so good because that person was afraid of expressing opinions. And then the last thing I want to point out, because it fits into this vignette, most radiology practice, the culture of radiology today is virtually automatic partnership. If you can stay upright in front of a workstation, not commit a major felony on a pediatric floor, and remain moderately continent, and if you wear a dark suit like Alex and I, the older people, remaining continent may not even be an issue. I mean, you're going to be a partner. Now, there are about 10% of practices that are starting to not offer partnership track, and I think that's a formula for disaster. But what I think is a formula for improvement is offering partnership with expectations, time not being the only expectation. And if you're going to do that, then you have to clearly define what is expected of your colleagues. And I mean clearly defined. You have to hit a radiologist with a 2x4 because most of us are not good at reading between the lines as was suggested in the vignette. So with that, I have many, many more things, but let's hear your questions and comments. Or not. Yes, in the back.
What are your thoughts on 360-degree evaluation?
What are my thoughts? I think they're vital. I think that they play an important role. I think that they should include both clinical and non-clinical skill sets. I think that there should be a review with the individual, and then most important, if there are deficiencies, then there ought to be a timeline set up for the remediation process to take place. I mean, you can't say to somebody, you don't communicate well, or you're not practice building. You have to tell the person, here's what we want and expect in a partner track person or an associate, and here is the way to get there, and you have 3 months to demonstrate the proficiency in the deficiency that you have.
So a bit of a different take on this, and I'm not the expert, and Frank, you may want to comment on this. There was an article in the Harvard Business Review in April, in fact, kind of saying we're going to move away from the 360 because they didn't find it very effective, and this is Deloitte, I believe. And it's a very interesting read, and I actually suggest you all go out and read it. As I say, it's, I forget the exact title, but it's in the April review, and essentially what they were saying, and I'd need Frank's help here to bolster what probably the article is saying, is we need to move away about what we think about people and how they perform, about what we would actually recommend they do. So rather than saying, I don't think this person performs particularly well in this area, they, I've spoken to other people and we think this or that, this is specifically what I would do with this person. And it sort of frames the question in a different way. And I think they had 4 categories. Is this person ready for promotion now? Is this ready for promotion next year? Is this person never ready for promotion? But as I say, I'm sorry, I don't remember all the details of the article, but they suggested that the 360 paradigm is something we need to move away from.
You know, on that note, I mean, I confess I haven't read the article. You know, I'm like most professors. I only read my articles in Harvard Business Review. But I certainly agree with the emphasis, you saw it on the slides, on behavior. But to your question, I think I agree with everything Larry said about 360 reviews. I think they're powerful, they're important, but I think you need a culture before you do 360 reviews. I think the organization in our little vignette, for them to do 360s, because that involves lots of people, would be a disaster, absolute disaster. Start with those one-on-one performance reviews, then you can think, walk before you run, then you can think about 360s. Because 360s, for better and for worse, in my experience, are very, very powerful mechanisms. But you want to be doing it when people already have a culture of honest give and take feedback. The organization in this vignette does not. First get that partner some training about giving feedback. Then 2-3 years from now, we can think about doing a 360.
Yes?
So a lot of the conversation has been around giving performance reviews to associates on the partner track. What advice would you have for an organization that's looking to do performance reviews for not just the associates that are on the partner track?
Well, I hope I didn't imply that it should just be associates. It should be everybody. Because interestingly enough, we've done at the economics meeting this data on how many groups have fired partners or associates in the last 5 years, and it's somewhere between 70 and 80%, up from about 15% 10 years ago. But the bottom line, and the very interesting thing is, once you account for a minimal difference with the ability to adapt to the practice initially, then the firing is partners and associates equally. It's not last in, first out. So I think it's critically important, and the reason I might disagree with Frank in terms of the effectiveness is we're pathologically addicted to democracy. So if one person is making these reviews, it has far, far less of an impact because her vote is the same as mine, and who is she to tell me what to do? Where if this is a consensus of 15 colleagues, I might not like it, but I think it's important. Second thing is, in my view, it's equally important to talk about the good things in a review, because you find out a lot of good things. I didn't know that they thought I was such a great radiologist. Good thing. Bad thing, I thought I was a great teacher. They think I'm a pedantic blowhard. I mean, I've got to deal with that. So mixing the good with the bad, I think, is very important. But to your point, which I know is the one you wanted to make, everybody should be reviewed, not just one subset of a practice.
But, if I could add to that, and that's actually what this, the last 5 minutes, that's where this research is particularly relevant. Yes, we didn't mean to suggest that partners shouldn't also be reviewed, but that is a slightly different conversation. Giles made the point, which I think is completely accurate, that the first few comments were personal, emotional. Boy, if you think those comments are emotional, wait till you start to do this with partners. And the smartest darn thing I did in the firm I ran for 12 years, because we would do this with the partners, and at our partner meeting, we would always begin, when we were small enough, to go around and say, just tell me about your life over the last year. Because when you're in a partnership, whether you like it or not, you are living with the fallout from those lives. So I think everything's right, but that is a more delicate conversation. It is at that stage.
I just wanted to add a couple of things, and I've learned these the hard way. So I've been chair of our department for 11 and a half years, and I made a lot of mistakes. And so one of the things that Larry mentioned is being direct. And hopefully I haven't become disrespectful, but I've become very, very direct. If somebody doesn't listen, I say, you're not listening when we're talking to you. Or when you engage other individuals, you do it disrespectfully. Do you understand me? I'm very direct with them. I don't pussyfoot around it, and I don't play it down, because I've realized that I have to be direct, otherwise I'm not convinced that I'm delivering my message. So being direct is something you have to develop. It may not come naturally to you if you're respectful and if you're non-confrontational, but it is an essential and a necessary tool that goes along with doing performance reviews. The second is documenting. Documenting is not natural or easy. After you have a difficult conversation, you have to somehow take notes about what you just did and what you just said, because that becomes a legal document. And that's also not natural and not easy. So whenever you have a difficult conversation, you have got to make a note to yourself. You can email it to yourself, put it in some kind of an H drive or a thumb drive, but you have got to keep that information, otherwise you don't have a documentary pathway. And finally, if you're having difficult conversations frequently with certain individuals, make sure that you engage HR or legal when necessary, or get your attorneys involved, because you want to make sure you've got the right infrastructure to do the necessary work that you have to do, and that includes putting in place performance improvement plans when necessary that are very clear.
Yeah. Giles, you'll have the last question because Frank wants 7 to 10 minutes.
I just have a quick comment. At least part of this is personal experience, is the ability of the mentor or leader to allow the colleague to open up on a relatively regular basis. And what do I mean by that? If you are there looking at your watch whenever, and I've seen this, you go in for a meeting and you're looking at your watch, and I've got another meeting coming in half an hour, it actually stifles the employee to be able to open up and ask questions and reach out and risk, if you will, with their mentor. In other words, how do I improve? What can I do better? You stifle the ability of that employee to do that, as opposed to a different type of leader who sits back and listens and asks poignant questions of genuine interest about that particular individual, and they're not on the clock. Of course, that's a particular skill, but you get, I think, a completely different buy-in and ultimately performance, such that when you come to performance review, it's less of a top-down type of conversation. It's more of we as an organization type of conversation. So I think we need to think about how we facilitate those conversations with our colleagues to bring out from them the necessary questions to then help them perform.
Last question.
This is in reaction to something that you said at the beginning that really resonated with me. So say you're in a situation where you have a boss that doesn't get someone to report to you. So when you go back to this new rep, is there anything that blocks could have done to then change that situation so that it became more effective?
Who are you referring to?
Well, he does it.
Oh.
So I think as a single individual in the middle of it, you can ask the parent for rules. That's very short-lived, and it's not durable typically. So for this organization to change, a couple of things have to happen. One of the things is a mentoring process has to be put into place so that the senior individuals are invested in the success of the junior people. But what that means is they need to self-identify with them, they need to have sufficient generativity to feel fulfilled by bringing people up. Without the creation of that, the 360s aren't going to work and you're not going to have a cultural change. So it starts with a mentoring system. The question is, who's going to put that in place? So you have to have a change in some way. My personal sense is that Ross by himself can get a little more value by asking for more direct feedback, but the organization is not going to serve that person well, in my opinion.
I just want to second that because I did experience this. And notice in the vignette, Ross does say, he says, well, what about my development, etc. Maybe he should have taken it the next step, to your point, Alex, and say, well, could you be more specific about this? But I think, you've got to remember the facts of a hierarchy. I think it's just naive to expect that young person who knows that somebody, one way or another, is going to vote on their promotion to, as we say, and I encourage you to speak up. I just don't see that happening very often. I do think it has to be put in place by the people at the top.
You've got your 7 to 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Let me explain what this is about. It's relevant to your question about the partners, but it's research you might find interesting. I'm going to go through it very quickly. Dalton and Thompson were two guys. One of them taught at the business school at Harvard, the other School of Education. They were hired in the 1970s by Sarnoff Labs. Does anybody remember Sarnoff Labs? A couple of heads, yeah. They were kind of the Apple of their day, very innovative. And what Sarnoff Labs said to Dalton and Thompson is, look, we noticed that we have a bunch of people, there's all software there by that point, we have a bunch of people that are only as good as their expertise. In other words, they're great at Pascal. When Pascal is obsolete, their productivity goes like this. But then we notice we have another bunch of people whose productivity continues to be good even when their underlying technical expertise seems to be obsolescent. And obviously we'd like more of the latter, less of the former. And so they asked these guys to look at this, and what they found, and then they started a firm. They have one of the best databases in the world. What they found was no magic bullet, but they found something more interesting about careers. And the research question they were researching is, what allows people who are high performers to stay high performers throughout a career? That is the partnership decision, right? The other issue there is you got to live with these people one way or another. How many of you are over 40? You're screwed. I'm joking. I'm joking. All right. What they found when they if you look at their data, is that performance ratings tend, in the aggregate across industries, to really just keep going up until people are in their mid-30s. Then, in the aggregate, it tends to decline. Now, if you think about this, this is intuitive. Why is that the aggregate slope of that curve? What goes on in people's lives? What's going to happen to, what's his name, Alex Ross? He's now, 2 years out of med school. What's going to go on with him over the next 5 to 10 years? One is the technical underpinnings change. What else goes on in your late 20s to your mid-30s? You get a life. God bless you. Fall in love. You may get married. You may have kids. The point is, if the way you've been productive is simply to work through, this is why the delegation is important, you're only as good as your arms can reach. That's why you've got to develop people. But the other thing Dalton and Thompson found out is that while this is true in the aggregate, there are high performers in every demographic group, so it's not simply age. Now, what they came up with, and again, I'll show you where you can go for the data behind this, what they found is that people who stay high performers very predictably are able to move through certain stages. This is their jargon for the stages, and it's aggregative. You do X, but then you learn to do Y. Again, you'll get the slides. Stage 1 is about earning the trust of your colleagues. Alex Ross has not done that. He hasn't earned the trust. And by the way, that is an employee's responsibility. If you want to have open dialogue, you have to earn their trust and they have to earn your trust. People whose performance you decide to invest in. Stage 2 is, I can trust you to get it done. That conversation the COO was having with Ralph. Stage 3, however, and this is where the partnership decision becomes relevant, is the ability to leverage others, assuming that we do grow. And then stage 4 is what a number of you are dealing with clearly, and that is setting direction in a changing industry. Again, you can read what this is about, but this is a question I want to ask, because the research here always surprises people. What do you think is the average age, according to Dalton and Thompson? This is now 30 years, one of the best databases about careers in the world. What is the average age of people in stage 1? Take a guess. 28. How many of you say it's 25 or less? How many of you say 25 to 30? How many of you say more than 30? Average age, people in stage 1, 38 years old. Remember what we're talking about. We're not talking about a job description. The fact that somebody's called a partner or a vice president doesn't mean they're stage 4. How many people do you have in your organization get out of school and do the same thing for the next 15 years? In this research, that's stage 1. Doesn't matter how much they're being paid or what you call them. How many average age people in stage 2? I'll give you a hint. It's not going to be less than 38. It's 38. Stage 3 is 39. Stage 4 something like 40. Read this. It's quite interesting. What explains stage growth in their research? It's easier to explain what doesn't. It's not the nature of the position, job tenure. This one always bugs me. Academic credentials. It's a random walk correlation. You know, what's the best marketing job of the 20th century? The MBA. There's absolutely no data to support having an MBA degree and business performance, but it's become a got-to-have. That is an amazing marketing feat, right? Professional specialty. I want to emphasize this because I can smell this in this room, Dr. Muroff. When I show this research to people, doesn't matter what profession they're in, I'll do this with, I've been doing a lot of work with high-tech firms in Silicon Valley. They look at this and say, yeah, that's our problem. We all have Asperger's, we're engineers. I do this on Wall Street. Oh, yeah, that's us. We're finance people, right? Oh, we're radiologists. No correlation with professional specialty. This is an equal opportunity issue. What does explain stage growth? What people do. Most adult learning is on the job. The assignments and opportunities they are or are not given to develop, and how they are or are not managed. There's a very good book that replicated this research about 10 years ago by the Gallup organization. It has a terrible title. Title was something like First Break All the Rules. And what they did was replicate this research, and unsurprisingly came up with the same results. But they had a very, very clever way of phrasing this. People join organizations, they leave managers. You understand what they were saying? I join your organization because you're prestigious, you do interesting work, I want to be part of that. And why did they leave? Because my boss was an asshole. That is the most common pattern. Performance reviews are vital to this process. They're also vital to your financial wherewithal. Think about what happens in the system you're describing. What happens is that over time, the fully burdened cost of that person is increasing. If their performance is not commensurate with that, you're going to encounter this gap. In IT, we call this gap Mumbai. That's why firms outsource, because of that gap. And this is inevitable if you're not managing performance. And the challenge, of course, in any business where the technical underpinnings are changing is how to remain at the top of your game over time. How to ensure that a specific type of expertise remains important. That's Alex's value add at this point. When that goes, what is he? He's that programmer at Sarnoff Labs that can do Pascal, end of story, period, etc. And whether any organization admits it or not, this is what they're always looking at. How does this person offer a better deal than recent graduates who may cost less, can't do the full job, but this is what disruptive innovation is about, but they can do 80% of the job for 50% of the fully burdened cost. That is the logic of outsourcing as well. My point of view on this is, I think this, and I see this throughout industry, I think the single most underutilized lever for affecting performance in organizations is the performance review. But to your point, it's got to be part of a wider culture. You got to know what you're doing. It is personal. It's very, very personal. There is training that's available that's off the shelf on this stuff that's pretty darn good, but if you don't do it, your colleagues are not going to do it. If your colleagues don't do it, you're not going to do it. It's a slippery slope to hell. All right? If you want to get better on this topic, I'm going to suggest the following. There's a book by a colleague of mine, Linda Hill, which is, I think, deservedly a classic. It's called Becoming a Manager. She looks at people who go from individual contributors to managing others. Does that sound familiar in radiology? This is one of the smartest books about that process you're going to read. Linda is absolutely first rate. The Dalton and Thompson research is in this book. There's an article that will sort of give you their book's research in small form by John Younger and Kurt Sandholz, especially relevant to businesses like yours. Then there's a brilliant book that was published late last year that doesn't look at radiologists, but does look at these various topics that were raised. Listen, I want to thank you all very much for your time, your attention, your participation, and being good sports with our little case. I want to wish you the very best in a changing marketplace. But I may be naive about this, but I think about sessions like this as professional development. And so I'd like to think that in some small, minuscule way, it also makes a contribution to your career as well. All right, so adios.